today, that our efforts might be blessed and that we might get a new vision, that we might move on, and that the work that we do will accrue to all of us, particularly our young people. In Jesus' name, amen. Amen.
Find myself esteem building techniques. So could you give applause for Jam Hobson?
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls. I'd like to thank the Department of Children and Family Services for giving me the opportunity to come out and talk to the young people, and especially the caseworkers and the foster parents who are responsible for you young people. Thank you very much for that opportunity. I had an opportunity to attend 2 of the workshops. I was not able to attend them all, but the one I did attend, I got an awful lot out of it, and I was deeply moved by some of the testimony that was given by the young people and the presenter. Now, I'm not accustomed to standing up and talking about my life and, in public, because it's a very private thing for me. But I've had the opportunity now, this is the 3rd time, the 3rd of 5 installments, the 3rd time that I've been able to talk about my life. And each time I've said that when I come up here and I talk to you young people and the rest of you, I'm not going to get emotional. And each time I always fail, which is one of my few failures in life. So I will try not to be, lose control. First of all, Karina seems like a very, very intelligent young lady, and it also appears as though she's going to go on to the speaking circuit herself. And I would like to invite her to be the MC at my annual banquet that I have for my young people. So let's give her a big round of applause. I will try to be brief, but I feel that the story that I have to tell you young people is very important and definitely important to the people who are responsible for you. The Department of Children and Family Services and the foster parents who are charged with that responsibility. As a youngster growing up in the suburbs of this city and in the city itself, the life that I lived was not what you call an ideal life. And I will try to give you some figures, and I hope that you will understand that that was then and this is now. First of all, as an infant at the beginning of my life, and not much time thereafter, I became a ward of the state. I was found in an abandoned building and immediately, obviously, put in the hospital for observation and for some of the wounds that I had received as a baby, a newborn baby. 6 months, I'm told after that, I was then placed into my first foster home. 6 months later. So that means I stayed in the hospital from the beginning of my life for up to 6 months after that beginning. The foster home I lived in was, as I look back at it, very ideal. I lived in the suburbs, an affluent white suburb with a black family, and back in the 50s and 40s that was unheard of. But yes, I lived in LaGrange, Illinois, and it's still an affluent community, and I still go back there often just to reminisce about some of the times that I had, both good and bad. Growing up there, I experienced some very difficult times, and I experienced some very good times. In terms of nurturing, I received the best possible training as a youngster. as a foster child housed with biological children of that family, it was not so good. For 7 years, I really grew up in a basement alone during the day. If you can think in terms of being put in solitary confinement for 6-7 hours a day for 7 years, you can imagine the effect that it might have on a youngster. Well, that's what happened. And unbeknownst to the foster mother that I was living with, she was, I was taken from her as a result of that, because the Department of Children and Family Services were notified that this was happening over a period of time and that I was missing school. They didn't know why. And they came to investigate, and here I was, locked in a basement. At least 7 hours a day for those 7 years. I went to school, had a great time in school, I had no learning difficulties, and I'm very grateful to the Department of Children and Family Services for being able to intervene at such an early age. But it wasn't until they took me away from that situation that I was to experience some of the worst times in my life. Not because of the Department of Children and Family Services, but because of the circumstances from which I was put in. After that initial foster home, I was then, to make it a long story short, placed in an additional 31 foster homes during the next 11 years, during the next 11 years. So for a total of 32 foster homes for my career. And I lived all over the city. I lived in Robbins, I lived in, you name it. I lived in all of those places in the suburbs. I also lived here in the city. But one thing was very difficult for me to understand as I went from home to home with that brown suitcase. One thing was always very difficult, and that was, why am I being moved from home to home and on such a regular basis? And I happened to stand in front of the judge, because in order for you to be placed at that time in homes, you had to come before the juvenile judge for that placement. And if any of you are familiar with the juvenile home out here on Ogden Avenue, then you'll know what I'm talking about. And by the way, that's a brand new one. The one that I was in that's in its exact place was a prison, not a juvenile home. But, so I happened to come before a male judge at that time. He had these black robes on, and I was a little fella, I was standing there not knowing what's going on. And I happened to look over as the judge was talking shop with the caseworker. And I happened to look over and read incorrigible. Incorrigible. That means I was, in essence, a bad apple, hard to place. And the judge, one day in 1958, I believe it was, had an encounter with one of my 11 caseworkers, because I had 11 over my 16 years. And so what happened is the encounter ensued, and she started crying. She started to weep, and I was wondering why she was weeping. I'm the one that's being, moved and shackled and handcuffed, to be taken back to the home. And little did I know that she was crying because I was going to be sent back there for an indefinite period of time because they didn't have any other placements. It was difficult to find placements for me. I had some serious difficulties in these homes with the biological children in that home, and in many cases, the father in that home. So I looked over and I said, incorrigible, and it stuck with me, and even to this day, I remember the word very well, and I talk about the word incorrigible with my thousands of young people every day out there at Garfield Park. But they labeled the gist of the whole scenario there is that they labeled me without ever having asked me a question. Now, I was being sent to psychologist after psychologist and mental specialist after mental specialist, and no one ever seemed to ask, why are you having such a difficult time in these homes? And on that particular day, though, I was actually sentenced, in my opinion, because the judge said we have no choice but to remand you to the custody of the juvenile authorities until such time that we can find a suitable place for you to live. So that, to me, at that time was, man, that's a sentence. And so they shackled me back around my waist, both arms, handcuffed, shackled at the feet, along with the rest of the inmates, and we all had to walk back across to the holding center. And to this day, I never could understand why they would have to shackle a young boy, 8, 9, 10 years old, to move him back to the home in which he came from, which is right across the way there. But as I lived that life in LaGrange, I will not forget all of the teachings that foster family, the surroundings in that community, the school that I went to, taught me and gave me, which brings me to believe that nurturing at an early age is extremely important. Extremely important. And as you can see by me standing here today, is a living example that nurturing at the earliest possible age, whether it be foster parents, whether it be the caseworkers, the judges who are intervening in these cases, is so important. Because when you get to be 9, 10, 11, 12, 13 years old, you've already formed your personality. And if that personality is not good, then the results are going to be seen out there on the streets of our cities across this nation. And we can see that now in Washington, in California, in Chicago, in Detroit. The loss of life of our teenagers and young people are the talk of the town, but no one seems to have the answers. And we bring in all these psychologists on these talk shows and sociologists and people in that profession to try to come to grips with some of the, come up with some of the solutions to these problems, when in fact, it's very simple. We have to go back, and one of the ladies mentioned that in the gang meeting today. She said we have to go back to the fundamentals of teaching our young people. And the gentleman, the presenter, and I thought it was an excellent speech that he gave. I disagree with one thing that he said. He said that we are not all in this together. We are not all in this together. There's black people, there's Hispanic, and then there's the other. And I disagree with that, because this is the United States of America, ladies and gentlemen, and if we're going to win this battle that cannot be lost, and I reiterate, cannot be lost, because hanging in the balance is the lives of these young people. I can't agree with him. I will never agree on that. While I loved his speech, that was not correct. We are in this together. This is America. We all live here together. And if you don't love your country, then why are we here? And what do we hope to accomplish? A little after the foster home experience, at 16, at that time, 16 years old was the cutoff limit. And my last foster home, the name of the family was Hobson. And remember now, I don't have a birth certificate. I had 5 different names during that 7-year period out there in the range. James Wilson, James Smith, James Williams, James Strong, and my last foster home was James Hobson. Okay? And we know that there are 3 types of placements in the Department of Children and Family Services: temporary, permanent, and what's the other one? Adopted. See, now I never got past the temporary stage, because I had to go from home to home. Here, 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 here. And yet, when I think in terms of the people on television who talk about the dictates and the norms of a society that is out of control in terms of its violence, I try to reason and try to understand how can they ask these young people who have experienced incredible obstacles be expected to become productive, useful citizens in our society. And I'm saying that I agree in principle, because we are a civilized society and we are America, and there are certain things that are required of us as Americans, and we have to fulfill those requirements irregardless of the circumstances. Irregardless of the circumstances that we are confronted with, we have an obligation as Americans, and we have an obligation as human beings to become productive, useful citizens in our society. So I wanted to get that point in. The other point, right after my foster home experience, that 16th year, I got into trouble with one of the girls in the home. She tried to stab me, and as usual, during those 16 years, I was always, defending myself. And yet, I was always castigated because I was always fighting. In any case, I found myself out on the streets. The juvenile authorities were called, and at that time they said, his 17th birthday is nearing, therefore we do not have control of him anymore. And so I was put out on the street. I went to Gregory School right over here on the west side of Chicago, and then Manley, which is now a high school, but it was then a grammar school. I had to drop out of that school. And I had not even gotten to high school because I had went to so many placements. And of those placements, those 32 placements, I had to go via the route of the juvenile home, which was 22 times. So I had to go into that home 22 different times in order to be placed in a foster home. And after that, I obviously didn't have any place to live. I didn't know anyone. As I said, I will not get emotional. But very difficult for those people on television to say to you young people who have no families, especially you who have no families, no relatives, no birth certificates, and are put in the care of the juvenile system. It's very difficult for them to understand that you have problems. Very difficult for you to respond to them and say, hey, look, in spite of my circumstances, I'm going to become a productive citizen. It's not that easy. I'm sorry. Now, back in 1966, and I won't belabor this point, after having been in the gangs for such a long time, from that period of foster home care, the end of it, to my 19th year, I was in the gangs. And I heard some of you gang members out there talking about the problems of gangs. I also heard the presenter talking about the parents responding to that. And then I looked on the wall of the gentleman who was standing next to me, and I heard their comments. We have a serious problem, ladies and gentlemen, in the United States of America, and especially in our urban areas. Cities across this country are devastated by the loss of life of our young people. The attitudes of these young people. We have got to get ourselves in check. We have to come up with some viable solutions that are going to help us all. In that gang, and I will not, and I refuse to name the gang, it is still probably the largest street gang in Chicago, and I was the undisputed leader of that gang. But how I first got into it, I was going to school over at Manley School, and one day after school, some of the gang members wanted to recruit me, and I refused. They beat me up very seriously and threw me in the garbage can the same day. But As fast as they threw me in that garbage can and the blood streaming, I came out of that garbage can, and what they didn't realize was that I was going to defend myself, not as a gang member, but as a human being who has a right to walk and go to school. From that day on, I never had another problem with the gangs. I quickly rose in the ranks. At that time, they called them the war counselors, the chief war counselors, and the undisputed leaders. In this day and age, they call them different names. Doesn't matter, it's all the same. To rise from each of those ranks is difficult, very difficult. Back in those days, fighting was the name of the game. Fighting to maintain your dignity, whether it be female or male. And I did that quite well, and I was pruned and primed and propped and everything in the foster homes. Because I had to come up against some pretty tough people in those homes. I always wondered where the foster parents were in terms of the foster children. What types of guidance did they give? Were they required to give? And as I went from home to home, I began to understand that I was there only on a temporary basis. And let me give you this example. When I went into the home with my caseworker, she would come in, I would come in with my brown suitcase. James, here's your new foster mother. Whoever the foster mother is, this is your new son. Now wait a minute. This is not my mother. It's a person, and this is the attitude that I, developed as I went from home to home, because it became a circus, a game. And those 11 caseworkers, they may have had the interest of me at heart, but they certainly didn't show it. And I'm not belaboring and I'm not criticizing you, because I know that you guys are doing a great job. But at that time, the caseworkers were merely transportation, and stand in front of that judge and say, yes or no, I don't have a placement. Okay, if you don't, then you're going to the juvenile home. Now, to put me in there as a dependent child, first of all, was wrong. I'm not a criminal. I was put there as a dependent child. And I've asked over the years if they still have that policy. They don't have that policy anymore. And I'm glad. They now have what they call group homes. Lord have mercy, I wish I had one of those.
No, you don't.
Is there a group home?
No, you don't. That's another form.
Okay.
Just a nice name.
All right. At least you don't have to go into that juvenile home. And those 22 times that I went there, I knew all of the guards, I got to know all the prisoners who came and went, and I also got to see a lot of death. Somebody mentioned in the workshop that we have a lot of emotional problems. You're right. When you are sentenced or told that you have to go to the juvenile detention center, can you imagine if you've already been in there, just all of these criminals, kids who have suicidal tendencies, and then you have what we call segregation. And they had a policy at that time. The dependent children during Wednesday and Sundays were put in isolation, which was really called the hole or solitary confinement. We were put, and there were only 3 of us who had no families, no relatives. And on visiting days, which were Wednesday and Sunday, they would put us in solitary confinement for the entire day until until the visiting hours were over. Now, if any of you have been in the juvenile detention center and have seen solitary confinement, I don't care how new the building is, solitary confinement is solitary confinement. How many people have been in solitary confinement? Difficult, huh? At that time, all you could see under those steel doors was a little bit of light. They turned out the lights for the entire day. And those who were in there for disciplinary reasons would stay for 2-3 weeks. We would stay 5, 6 hours, however long visiting hours took. But it was a prolonged period of time because visiting hours were every Wednesday and Sunday. So we were essentially put in there because we didn't have families, relatives. So that was very difficult for me, very difficult, especially when the last time that I went to the juvenile home and that judge looked over and said, I have no choice but to send you. At that time, you could see out the window, it was big giant bars, and I looked out at 11 years old and I said, this is it. I will never see daylight. So you, caseworkers, you play a major pivotal role in the guidance of these young people. You're the ones that have to find the homes for them. You play a major role, and I applaud you. But what they didn't do at that time was ask us how we feel. All they said was, you're going here, you're going there, and I just sort of grew up. I didn't grow up angry, but I did grow up. And when I went to those gangs, and I'll tell you, it was not easy, fighting every day like cats and dogs and animals, and as a result of that activity, arrested 66 times. 66 times. Sentenced to the county jail any number of times. 47 of those 66 times was before a single judge who is going to be with me on June 13th to receive this tremendous honor. And I just can't imagine him not being there. Here's a judge who sent me to jail 47 times, and yet I love him as a father because he showed that he cared. He took me aside on those benches when he sentenced me, sat me down and said, you see, and sentenced these boys and young men before him to hundreds of years in prison. That scared the hell out of me. But I was so involved in the gangs and so enmeshed in that community that even after he told me, you see this record, and the prosecutor unleashed a long list just like this, just like you see on television, and said, this can send you to jail for the rest of your life. And then I remembered back as a juvenile when that judge said something similar. I said, this can't be. I'm not going to allow this. And so I straightened up. Not without difficulty, because that next day, after he let me go, he didn't sentence me that day, I got into a fight at Marshall High School. A big fight. And I was right back before him the next day. He recessed court, took me into his chambers, and asked me, what is wrong with you? What is wrong with you? And after me telling the story, he understood. And there's a lot of me's like, there's a lot of me's out there. Right here. Right there. Right there. And I see through you. I know what you're going through. And I see through those thousands of young people that I have to deal with on a daily basis out at Garfield Park. Let me give you a figure. Back in July of 1992, last year, the whole nation was in an uproar over the 25 murders that occurred on that weekend. Everybody remember that? 25 murders in one weekend here in Chicago. But what they failed to say was that 18 of those murders occurred right at Garfield Park, in that Garfield Park community. 4 of them were my young people who participated in my programs. I went to their funerals. I said I would never go to another funeral after 1965, having went to 105 of them. 105 funerals and wakes. We even had our club meetings in the funeral home so that we could be close. That was, can you imagine the experiences, the emotional difficulties? Staggering. But yet I am required by the dictates of this country, bound by law, to become a productive, useful citizen. And you are too. And so when I hear people talking about the gangs and their experiences, look, It's difficult to say stay away from the gangs when you have an economic the economic problems that we have in our country and the social problems that affect us. Very difficult. You can't tell the kids out in the Garfield Park community on the west side to stay away from the gangs when they have to put money in their pockets to take care of their families in many cases. Mothers and fathers. Difficult to do. So we have to change the agenda on young people in this country. We have to change the agenda. We have to get about the business of listening to these young people. I took a job up at Kiwanis Park. I was asked to do that in 1980. And at that time, between 1975 and 80, there were 18 murders in and around that park during that 5-year period. And I was asked to come in. I was teaching employment courses for private corporation. And I went in there with an open mind. I understood the problems, but nobody told me about the 18 murders. Nobody told me that 3 supervisors were shot at and chased out. Nobody told me that. So I came in with my suit and tie on and my briefcase. There was a tremendous fight on the basketball court. I turned around and went home and got into the right clothes. Came back, and ladies and gentlemen, for the next 10 years, there was never another murder. There was never another fight. And in 1989, Kiwanis Park was named as the best park in Chicago. There are 561 parks, beaches, and pools in the system. And for one playground, the size of this room, to be named the best park in the city is quite an honor. So, I don't want that. I'm trying to get this point across. The point of the matter is that something happened there for those 10 years. Could it have been that I listened to those young people? Could it have been that I knew what they needed? Could it have been that you needed someone who understood the rigors that these young people go through? And remember, thousands, many thousands. I was responsible for delivery of service to a community, in that particular community, of about over 10,000 people. It was the only park and one school in that whole community. And so much of what I did or didn't do rested on my shoulders and that principal in that school. And we came together as a unit, and we decided that we had had enough. And I read about all of the articles and all of the murders and all of the mayhem. It's not going to be. We've got to do something. And so we had to build these coalitions together. And that's exactly what we did. Brought in corporate sponsors. As a matter of fact, Reebok. I brought them in. They gave us over $100,000 worth of equipment. Brought in Nike Corporation. They built us a brand new basketball court. One of only 5 parks in the entire nation. So there are things that can be done. You do not have to always go to these psychologists and say, well, listen, what is the psychological reason for these problems out here with these young people? The real reason, one of the main problems that we have is that we don't listen to our children. They have a right as an American and as a responsible individual to voice their complaints, their wants, their needs, and we are not doing it. We tend to say, this is what you need. Well, I challenge all of you to go back to the basic fundamentals of fair play. If you're going to ask a ball player, how much do you want for playing for me, you can certainly ask a kid, what would it take to get you out of this situation? After that, after the 66th time of being arrested, I asked for the assistance of joining the military service. I was rejected 4 times by each branch. That's 12 times rejected because of my record. And it still stands today. I refuse to have it expunged. I wanted to stand as an example. But 12 times I was rejected. I entered the military service. I've graduated from Drill Sergeant Academy, which is a very difficult thing to do. That's almost impossible. Only a few people do that. I trained tens of thousands of troops and prepared them for combat in Vietnam. Tens of thousands. I then decided that I had not had any combat experience. And because of all of these men's lives that I affect, I felt that they needed someone who had experience in a combat situation. And so I volunteered for Vietnam. And I went over there, and for 16 months we did battle. I led 47 men on the battlefields of Vietnam. Our mission was very simple: to seek out, capture, and destroy the enemy. And we did that in an abandon. We did it very, very professionally. But, and some of my men will tell you now, I still talk to them, they will tell you that Sergeant Hobson would always go to the dead people and pray over them after killing them. Now, because of the value of human life that I put on people, I put a tremendous value on human life. Whether we take it as a nation, or whether I see it out on the battlefields of Garfield Park, it's the same thing. The cry is always the same. I just can't imagine killing a person. But we see it every day, and it's getting worse. No matter what corner you live in, no matter what hamlet, no matter where you live in this country, violence is affecting us all. I not only went into the service and went to Vietnam, but when I came back, I tried out for the elite units of the United States Army, which was the Green Berets. And only if you hear the statement there that John Wayne makes and other people in the song, 100 people are tested, but only 3 win the Green Berets. That means you have to be able to speak 4 languages fluently. You have to be able to kill a man in a second. Now, I don't like doing that. I didn't like doing it, but I felt that goals and objectives was something that I had in my life. I did not want to die on the streets of the city of Chicago. I did not want to die on the battlefields of Vietnam. And just before I went, I realized at that moment, after they accepted me and said it's okay for you to go to Vietnam, if I get killed, I said to myself, between 2 barracks on a stormy night at Fort Jackson, South Carolina, I said, if I get killed, who's going to bury me? So in spite of all of that accomplishment, I still went back to, who am I? What's going to happen to me? If I die, that means I'm going to go to a pauper's grave. And everybody know what a pauper's grave is. If you don't, it's a grave where unwanted corpses are buried with no headstone, and you're just there. And I've been to those places many times, and I've seen my buddies who I fought back to back with out on the streets and side by side with in those holes. And they're there now, rotting away without ever having lived. Without ever having lived. So I'm in a sense speaking for them. I was one of the few that made it to this point. But goals and objectives, young people, when you get into the gang situation, the drug situation, the alcohol situation, goals and objectives. What is it going to take for me to get out of there? First of all, I have to have someone that cares, and then I have to have a chance of getting out. In other words, a situation. I have to have a situation in which I can see at the end of the tunnel that there is a possibility. And guess what? All that time I was out there on those streets, I always remember what I was taught as a youngster. Respect life. In spite of having grown up in that basement, respect life, respect your fellow man, and be a good person. And all that time I was fighting, all that time I was getting into trouble with the police, all that time I came before the judge, all the times in the juvenile detention center 22 times, those 32 placements. All of that still requires that I become a productive, useful citizen in our society. So the path from that hospital for those 6 months of my life, those first 6 months of my life, to this podium today is proof positive that if you have goals and objectives and try to accomplish them one by one, you have an opportunity, boys and girls, ladies and gentlemen, to succeed in life. You will not, I repeat, you will not end up in that pauper's grave. You will not. And 6 months later, those people who supposedly are your buddies have forgotten you, have forgotten you. Those of you who have no parents, no relatives, my hats go off to you more than anybody in this world, because I know how difficult it is for you to understand this world that we are living in. I have never tried to find out who I am, because I do know, I know. I can go from one side of the town and be the worst person in this city at that time. Mayor Daley said that. And then come back on this side of town 25 years later, have the Rogers Park Community Council name me as 1990 Citizen of the Year. Have the police department name me the 1985 Citizen of the Year. The Rogers Park Tenants Committee's 1987 Citizen of the Year. Not only that, Chicago's Medal of Honor, which is the highest award that a civilian can receive. And then to turn back around and all these years later in 1990 receive the highest honor as an employee. 48,000 people. Superior Public Service Award as the top employee in the city of Chicago. Now, if I can do all of that, right, have the state legislature pass a resolution in my honor, that is a tremendous honor. The state, the governor, the mayor of Chicago, all of those people who had said all of those things about me, and yet be able to achieve beyond that, something must have fell right for me, upstairs as well as out here. And so I thank the Department of Children and Family Services for saving me, and I thank the public guardian, Patrick Murphy, who next week I will be talking with, and on the 13th will receive its highest honor. I thank the public guardian for saving me, and in spite of all of those experiences in that juvenile detention center, I thank them for saving me, because it did act as a buffer between me and those streets. You know, living out on the streets homeless for 5 years, between 16 and 20, was not an easy thing. Frostbitten hands, I still have frostbite. Sleeping on those L's, day in and day out, trying to figure out which routes offered the best, the longest sleeping possibilities. Some of the older people might remember the Clark Theater downtown. I would try to get enough money to buy my way into that theater so that I could sleep all night, because it was an all-night theater. You had to learn these things. You had to learn survivability. You had to have those skills. You had to have them. It's not easy waking up in that theater and having men touching your privates. 16, 17 years old, right? Not easy. And no one yet today has asked me, how did it feel being in those foster homes, causing havoc out on those streets because of the situation that you were involved with. I'm still a human being. And guess what? Having worked in employment for so many years as an employment counselor, I want to pass this on before I stop. You young people are going to be going out into the workforce fairly soon, if you're not out there already. I had an opportunity to be a job developer, work as a job developer, veterans employment representative, an employment counselor, all of that at the Department of Labor here in the state of Illinois. And many things I picked up. One thing I will never forget, and in my classes that I teach, wherever I go to speak, you young people are going to be required to sit for at least 10 to 15 minutes before someone who you would like to be employed with. And if that person on the other side of you is sitting there, that means that you have to present yourself. If you cannot present yourself in a timely, intelligent fashion, your possibilities for work are limited. Most people who have not been in the employment field or have worked in it don't realize that 45% of the success or failure of a job interview has little or nothing to do with education. Nothing. You know, I get this from thousands of employers at the corporate level and all other levels. If you cannot express yourself, you will not get a job. I don't care how good you are. So that means perception, how you are perceived by that employer sitting across from you or his representatives. If I took my coat off right now, took my tie off, opened my shirt, how do I look now? Exactly. But I'm going to put that back on, I'm going to walk out the door and I'm going to go to work. So think about it, boys and girls. Earrings. I talk to my boys and girls every day, thousands. Thousands. Guess what? I'm responsible for the delivery of service to over 100,000 people. Me. I have over 65 employees in my employ. That's a lot of people. That's a lot of people. So how did I get to this point from those first 6 months in the hospital of my life, through the gangs, through the foster homes, through the detention center, and I forgot to tell you, Boys Farm School in Durand, Illinois. Anybody familiar with that? Boys Farm School, is it still there? Still there, still there. I was there. And Boys Town in Nebraska. How many of you been in Boys Town? Me too. So just think, that's a hell of an experience for someone to go through in a short 47 years, and then go into the service, and then come home and then take over the largest park in Chicago. That's not easy. So goals and objectives. I did not want to die on the streets of the city of Chicago. I listened to the parents that I was with as much as I could. They did give me the nurturing that I did in spite of the physical abuse, the emotional abuse, and the mental abuse. In spite of all of that, I'm still producing. You can understand me. I'm sure that you perceive me as somewhat intelligent. Now, that means when I was in those gangs, what was I doing? Well, I had to learn how to talk a different way. I had to learn how to walk a different way. I had to learn a whole new demeanor because I was a serious SOB. And I was a fighter to the maximum. Any or everything out there that wanted to come my way, I fought. And I really understand now why I did it. Nobody ever stopped to say anything decent to me up until that point where I was able to break from the gangs. Nobody ever asked me how I felt in those foster homes. Nobody asked me how I was in those foster homes. And let's face it, some of them are not so nice. I'm sure the majority of them are, because I had some great experiences. But I would not want to go to 32 foster homes anymore. But I had no choice. No choice. Bound by circumstances. The question is, are you man enough? I shouldn't even use that phrase. Let me throw it out. Are you human enough to withstand the powers of evil? Are you strong enough to withstand the obstacles? Can you stand up in face of all of that and produce? And I'm saying that as long as I live, before my eyes close for the last time, I will always remember those things that happened to me and use them as tools to come up with solutions to the problems of these young boys, these girls. Thank you very much. I'm going to put my tie back on. I know that you young people are going to produce. I know you're going to be standing up there one day, I hope. Thank you.
First of all, I would like to say we give Mr. Hobson another round of applause. Mr. Hobson, this is for you. As I sat down and I listened to what you went through in your life, I would just like to say you are truly an inspiration to me, because I too have went through a lot of things that you went through, and just listening to you put so much on my heart and on my mind, and it let me know a negative situation can always turn into a positive success. And I want you to know that I'm truly grateful to have met you today, and I will say something to you that is positive, because like you, I never had too many people to say something positive to me. I think you're a great person, and the things that you had to overcome, you have learned a lot, you have grown a lot. And to everybody in this room, I may not know you, but I love you all. And if you have some things that you have to overcome, like Mr. Hoskins, we all can do it, and we can fight for it, we can work for it. And I would like to say thank you for your inspiration.